Private notice question on the risk of genocide in Darfur. Lord Alton of Liverpool.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask a question of which I've given private notice. The question is as follows: to ask His Majesty's Government, following the discovery of mass graves and an increase in crimes targeting non-Arab ethnic groups in Darfur, what assessment they have made of the risk of genocide in that region.
My Lords, the UK strongly condemns the abhorrent attacks on civilians across Sudan. Reports of atrocities, including the UN report of a mass grave in Darfur, are of course deeply disturbing. These atrocities need full and thorough investigations. Those responsible must be held accountable. The evidence suggests another crime against the people of Sudan. Our immediate priority is, of course, to stop the violence in Sudan, ensure civilians are protected and secure immediate, safe and unfettered humanitarian access. But we remain very seized about the importance of investigating these attacks.
Well, Lord the Minister, for that reply. The reports of mass graves come from Janina, a place which I visited during the genocide in Darfur, when hundreds of thousands died and 2 million people were displaced, many of them fleeing to Chad. And the Noble Lord will recall the recommendations contained in the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sudan's report, following the inquiry which I chaired and which was published in April, warning of a risk of a new genocide in Darfur. My Lords, how are we fulfilling our duties in this 75th anniversary year of the Convention on the Crime of Genocide, which places on us and on the international community the duty to predict, to prevent, to protect and to punish those responsible for atrocities targeted, in this case, at non-Arab ethnic groups in Darfur? And how are we assisting the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan KC, who told the United Nations Security Council last week that, and I quote, "We are in peril of allowing history to repeat itself. Darfur is not on the precipice of a human catastrophe, but in the very midst of one. It is occurring." Are we collecting the evidence? Are we protecting those at risk? And are we stopping that catastrophe from unfolding?
My Lords, first of all, on the question of the ICC prosecutor, I agree with him, and I think that is why we're working very closely with Karim Khan, and it was during the UK presidency last Thursday that Karim Khan gave the evidence. I think it's also important that he recognise that the conflict, during this conflict and in Darfur, that the ICC has a continuing mandate, and as the Noble Lord will know, it's investigating the issues directly of whether genocide has occurred, crimes against humanity, and of course war crimes more generally. So we become very much focused on this. In terms of evidence collection, we have a central unit within the FCDO that allows us to collect some of the evidence in a remote fashion. There is, of course, issues of access in Darfur. I remember visiting Darfur myself, and the challenges when there was access were still immense. But the first step, as I said, must be that there is a resolution on the ceasefire between the two warring sides to allow for full assessment to be made.
My Lords, what Karim Khan said at the Security Council was about impunity, and he actually gave the historical cases, and we've still got court cases continuing. And one plea he made to members of the Security Council was what pressure would be put on the government of Sudan to cooperate fully with the ICC. So can the Noble Lord the Minister tell us what we are doing in terms of putting pressure on Sudan so that people can't act with impunity in the future?
My Lords, as I've already said, we're working very closely with the prosecutor, but of course, as the Noble Lord will be aware, there are various avenues at the moment which are being pursued in Sudan on the whole issue of resolving this conflict. But the first thing about having a ceasefire, we're working with regional counterparts in IGAD, in the African Union, and we're also working as part of the Quad, including the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the UAE and the US, and of course we have Troika responsibilities historically to Sudan. All these avenues are very much focused on, first and foremost, stopping this conflict, and secondly, as the Noble Lord has articulated, ensuring that these crimes are fully investigated, and those who have committed the crimes, there shall be no impunity for those crimes.
My Lords, are we not all in the debt of Lord Alton for raising this matter this afternoon? But is it not deeply disturbing that the Security Council, mentioned both by Lord Alton and Lord Collins, has two permanent members who are themselves implicated in crimes against humanity, and it's very possible that they could be defined as genocide as well?
My Lords, I think the importance of the UN Security Council has, over the years and since the establishment of the United Nations, sought to actually provide a forum, and it continues, notwithstanding the current challenges we face from certain members, a way in which we can address the issues of conflict present, but also seek to avert conflicts in the future. It serves an important role. I hear what noble lords say, and of course we pursue all issues and concerns that arise from any member of the international community, any member state, in a forceful manner through bilateral representations, as well as addressing them through multilateral fora.
Declare an interest that I am actively involved in supporting dialogue with Sudanese civilians, including last week in Addis Ababa. Will the Minister agree with me that there is now a very real risk of ethnic and tribal conflict across the whole of Darfur, but there is a chink of light that the people, civilians, resisted calls by Mini Manawi and other leaders to arm themselves, and all efforts should be focused on supporting the current talks in Chad, which are multi-talks, multi-ethnic, which potentially could offer an opportunity for wider talks in Sudan. 200,000 Sudanese have fled into Chad at the moment. This is a crisis that, as Lord Alton had said, we can see ahead of us, but it is one that can be prevented.
My Lords, I recognise the important work that the noble Lord is doing in this respect, and I very much appreciate the strong engagement we continue to have outside the chamber. I also recognise the importance of civilian engagement at this crucial time. The noble Lord and I have discussed this particular matter, and we will be pursuing to see what role the UK can play in strengthening that particular voice. Of course, as I said, we're engaged at all levels with all key negotiations taking part. Ultimately, it does require both sides to actually cease their current crimes. Both generals actually currently believe that their reason for being is to beat the other one into non-existence, and that ultimately means that civilians suffer. On the humanitarian crisis, it's eye-watering to see what was displacement both internally and externally prior to the conflict, and sadly and tragically this continues, running not into the hundreds or the thousands but into the millions.
My Lord.
As
the Minister is aware, the impact of Darfur has on neighbouring countries is very serious indeed, and many, as has been stated, fleeing into neighbouring countries, particularly in South Sudan, where the humanitarian crisis is already a major concern. So with many in famine, already in famine circumstances, and with the UN aid programme stretched to the limit, can the Minister explain what we're doing to assist those who have fled Darfur?
Well, first and foremost, as the noble Lord Alton and the noble Lord Purvis have mentioned, those who are often fleeing are those who are greatly targeted, including many minorities. In terms of the mass grave that was found, and indeed early evidence is showing that it was 87 ethnic Masalit were actually found in that mass grave. On the noble Lord's specific question, we are and recognise the importance of South Sudan, but the supply chain to South Sudan is through Sudan, and there have been increasing reports of the supplies being held up, or indeed those supplies being seized by the warring factions. That's why we need to ensure that all these different avenues currently of diplomatic channels are fully explored, and a key message needs to be given to both sides that they need to cease this warfare now, so that this humanitarian aid can reach both the people of Sudan and, as the noble Lord said, South Sudan as well.
African Union, and of course it is the support of the African Union we're going to need consistently in addressing this horror and indeed similar horrors that are likely to occur in the future. Is he aware that the African Union as a whole has recently applied to join the G20, arguing that Africa has no adequate voice in geopolitical affairs or in gaining the support of the wider world in the problems that we're discussing now? Is that something that he would look on favourably, or the government would look on favourably? And is this a way forward in which we can work more closely with the African Union anyway, 21 members of which happen to be members of the Commonwealth?
My Lords, I of course noted very carefully, during the Indian G20 presidency, this was something pursued by India in both the invitations extended and the role of the African Union. And I think there is a case to be made as we see the different moving of powers and power centres, that it's not just the European Union or Western Union blocs, but equally important are the African Union in terms of what they present, both in terms of conflict resolution, but also empowerment of communities across the continent.
My Lords, it saddens me greatly, like other noble lords in the House, about what's happening in Sudan. I've had the privilege of working with women parliamentarians and civil society of Sudan, and Sudan is a country of great potentials. Can Noble Lord, the Minister, assure us that he's also taking on board what's happening to women of Sudan, and particularly how are we making sure that conflicts, rape and pillage of women and families are not being used as weapon of war, given the worsening situation?
My Lords, I assure the noble lady we continue to focus on the plight and the terrible tragedy that's unfolding in Sudan, but the particular focus on women and girls, as she points out. It's not just in Sudan, it's a tragic fact that wherever conflicts occurs, the most vulnerable are attacked, and that includes women and girls. And that's why only on Friday I was chairing a session of the UN Security Council focused on preventing sexual violence in conflict, where we introduced State Up, a new guidebook as well, working with the Mukwege Foundation, of what action states can take in terms of prevention, not just in addressing live conflicts. But I agree with the noble lady, and I assure her both my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, the Development Minister, as am I as the Multilateral Minister, are very much focused on delivering those exact messages. But this is a simple case of human values. The kind of abhorrent crimes we see against women and young girls is shocking, to say the least. When you see victims as young as 4 or 5 or 6, if not younger, being attacked, raped and pillaged in conflicts, and that includes in situations such as conflict in Sudan and indeed elsewhere in Africa, for example in the DRC, we must act, and we will continue to work collectively to ensure that we can put these abhorrent practices into the history books.
My Lords, as we've already heard from the noble Lord, Lord Alton, the situation in Darfur is dire, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to be reminded of that. At least 6 towns and villages have been burnt to the ground alongside numerous cultural sites. And we've heard little about the effect on girls and women and boys over the age over fighting age are being shot. Understandably, many of the targeted Masalit ethnic group are fleeing to surrounding countries. We've heard about those going to South Sudan, but the vast majority are going to Chad. What steps will the government be taking to provide Chad with support with the refugee crisis as a result?
My Lords, the Right Reverend Prelate raises again an important area of the issue of the displacement of refugees. We've already made a series of announcements in terms of support for the stability of Sudan and its near neighbours. At the moment, we have, alongside our 5 million commitment to help the urgent needs of refugees and returnees in South Sudan and Chad, we've also, through the Development Minister, made a further commitment of £21.7 million, which were announced specifically for humanitarian aid for Sudan as part of our contribution at the UN Horn of Africa conference. We'll continue to assess the key issue, but referring back to other questions, the challenge is not just about providing the money and support, it's about ensuring that humanitarian aid reaches those most in need.
My Lords, 2 decades ago in Darfur, systemic rape was used as a weapon of war as a part of ethnic cleansing and genocide. No one has been kept accountable, and those same crimes are being repeated today. Can my noble friend tell the House what concrete steps are we taking so that documentation this time around is sufficient so that we reach accountability not as aspiration but as a reality?
Yeah. My Lords, I agree with my noble friend, and also I'm sure acknowledge that the steps we have taken in ensuring that testimonies of those who have survived sexual violence in particular, but other crimes, are fully documented. There's often very well-intentioned NGOs, INGOs, representatives in the field, but their collection of evidence can sometimes negate the impact of allowing a successful prosecution. So steps we've taken in terms of concrete steps include, as the Noble Lady knows, the Murad Code, which allows for not a time limited, but ensuring that evidence can be collected, sustained, to allow for successful prosecutions. And indeed, that's why we're working very closely with international courts such as the ICC and the prosecutors specifically to ensure that the connection between testimony collection and prosecution is something which is very live.
My Lords, we are aware of the extensive involvement of the Wagner Group in this conflict and its associated criminal activities. But if one is to believe the messages coming from Moscow, and I admit that's a bit of a stretch, the Russian government is taking direct control of the Wagner Group and its activities. So what assessment has His Majesty's government made of the direct involvement of the Russian government in the conflict of Sudan, which of course is hardly likely to simplify the challenge of achieving a lasting peace?
Yeah. The noble and gallant Lord raises a very key point, and of course we're fully aware of the growing influence of the Wagner Group across many conflicts in Africa. In terms of Russia and Russian state and non-state activities in Sudan, we are making repeated representations and concerns over others, both near neighbours but also other countries who have influence. We are particularly focused on Russian activities in Africa, which include reports of Wagner Group involvement in gold mining, specifically, and in disinformation campaigns in Sudan. But the noble and gallant Lord is right. It is a very key concern at the moment with the growing influence and the instability caused by the Wagner Group. And as we've seen, it's not a reliable partner, and even the Russians are learning that lesson.
My Lords, the time allocated for this question has now elapsed. Shall we take a moment to shuffle the benches?